Hey, Dr. Dag, excited for you to see my last little digital presentation here on Peru from the 20th century onward. I gotta say, after having studied this, I really liked, leading up to, the end of the 19th century way more. I thought it was just a little more interesting with like conquistadors and the Incan Empire and, I don't know, some of the nationalism and revolutions and even the uh, like pre-Incan civilization. I thought that was really cool compared to some of this stuff. But hey, I hope you like my presentation. So here we go. All right. So post-war Pacific. The War in the Pacific forced Peru to start a major rebuilding effort. This included some serious economic and social reforms, led to political stability, and then in 1899, Nicolas Piarola, his presidency ended. So, the period basically from 1900 into the 1930s was called the Aristocratic Republic, and was given this name because a lot of, not a lot of, mostly like Augusto Lagulla, um, but other political leaders as well in Peru were from like social elite families, super wealthy. I don't know, kind of like think of like I don't know, like the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts, but in Peru. So also at the same time this happened, 1899 to the 1930s, huge influx of American investment in Peru, which was good, also good for the Peruvian economy. So at the same time, there's also peace between, official peace between Peru and Chile. The peace treaty, called the Treaty of Lima, was signed in 1929, and Peru actually ended up giving several of its wealthy provinces back to Chile. These two provinces were Arica and Tarapacá, but Peru still had rights, if you want to call them that, to the ports in those two provinces, and was still able to sort of direct Chile in what it could and couldn't do in those two areas. There's also a lot of political strife. The APRA was a nationalist organization led by Victor de la Torre, and then in the 1930s, thousands of members of the APRA were executed or put in jail. And then after World War II, the APRA and the Peruvian Communist Party were the two biggest factions in Peruvian politics. Victor de la Torre was actually elected as president twice in Peru, and both times the military actually intervened and would not allow him to take office. So in World War II, sort of at the same time here as the APRA stuff, Peru joined the Allied powers in 1944, opposing the Axis following several other Latin American countries. These countries included Brazil, but did not include Argentina, who was a huge pro-Axis ally in Latin America. And then kind of a crazy part of Peruvian history that I had never heard of before, but Peru actually sent 2,000 Japanese immigrants to the United States to stay in Japanese internment camps in the U.S. So post-World War II, like I said before, the APRA and the Peruvian Communist Party were the two largest factions in politics. In 1948, there was a movement to make the APRA illegal, but the president refused. And then in 1948, a military coup put Manuel Odria in power. He banned the APRA, which pleased a lot of like the well-to-do, wealthy families in Peru. But at the same time, he's also running a campaign that basically like won over the lower income families in Peru as well. In spite of like his having great control, control's not the right word, but in spite of his having influence, positive influence on like lower middle income families and the elite, there are actually huge restrictions on civil rights, and corruption was rampant. So again, more sort of continued political unrest here. Manuel Odria held an open election in 1956, And Fernando Terry tried to run for president, but the National Election Board refused his presidency. And we're going to hear about this guy, Fernando Terry, pretty much throughout the rest of this PowerPoint. The next day, there were protests in the streets over his not getting the presidency, and then ultimately the government supported this guy, Manuel Ugarte. And then in 1962, there were elections again, but there were widespread rumors of voter fraud, and the military intervened. And in 1963, there were elections again, and Fernando Terry won the elections. So, inspired by the Cuban Revolution and other Latin American communist organizations, the Revolutionary Left tried to overthrow the government, but were stopped in 1965. Military intervention happened a lot in Peru, basically from the 1940s up to the 1990s. And then in 1968, General Juan Alvarado ousted Fernando Terry, and the military ruled over Peru up until 1980. So Fernando Terry, again, became president in 1980, reestablished freedom of speech, actually gave a bunch of newspaper companies back to their original owners so that they could write whatever they wanted in the newspaper as opposed to being like redacted and censored by the military. And then he actually tried to undo some of the military ties between the U.S. and Peru. The next year, there's actually some pretty serious economic hardship in Peru. It was an El Nino year, and the weird, storm systems caused by El Nino caused droughts in some parts of Peru, extreme flooding in others, and then it decimated the fish population off the coast, meaning that fishermen weren't able to catch as much, therefore couldn't sell as much, not making as much money. And then Argentina got involved in the Falklands War with the UK, and Fernando Terry backed Argentina religiously. He said, Argentina has our utmost support, and they provided fighter aircraft to the Argentine troops, Air Force personnel, I assume like people that flew the aircraft, maintainers, logisticians, ships, and even medical supplies and personnel, which I thought was crazy. I never knew that Peru was actually involved in the Falklands War, which I think is really cool. I was a paratrooper in the Army. I've trained with the British 3 Para, so I was really sort of excited to learn about this stuff. Having trained with the British paratroopers and their history in the Falklands War is like a pretty big deal to them. So I was a big fan of it, so I thought this was super cool to learn about. So 1985 was the first ever transfer of power from one democratically elected official to another in the history of Peru. The APRA was sort of the major faction in power in Peruvian politics. But the economy was really bad. Inflation between 1985 and 1990 made the economy super unstable. At one point in 1990, the average annual income per household in Peru dropped as low as $720. And I read somewhere else that inflation went up almost as much as 7,200%. In this time frame between 1985 and 1990, making Peruvian currency almost useless. And so this political instability led to a rise in terrorism in Peru. Big organization in Peru being the Shining Path. And then Shining Path was fought a lot by the Peruvian military, who is still dealing with the legal aspect of some of the war crimes committed there between those two, both on the Shining Path side and the Peruvian military side. So in the 1990s, Albert Fujimori became president in 1990, and then here we go. Alberto dropped inflation from over 7,000% to just over 100 in a year, and the exact number on that, so he dropped it from over 7,000 to 139% in 1 year. And he actually dissolved Congress and gave total control so that he could have total control over the government, and he also eliminated the Constitution and overhauled the economy, making a very investment-friendly economy in Peru. And then he did battle with the Shining Path throughout the 90s, committed several atrocities and war crimes. There's a few massacres referred to, a couple of different sources that were all considered pretty terrible. So, and there is my 3 biggest works cited sources. Yeah, so Peruvian history in the 20th century, very politically unstable, very economically unstable, and in a lot of ways very violent. So I hope you liked my brief presentation here. It's been a great semester. Learned a lot, and I hope I have more of your classes soon, Dr. Dag. It's been great. Have a good one.